the rusted metal ladder rungs echoing under Captain Sarah Brennan's prosthetic leg as she climbed the abandoned water tower in rural Montana for the first time. Hidden within the supposedly empty 100,000-gallon structure, a sophisticated underground bunker system containing $280 million in stolen military equipment and classified documents that would expose the largest defense contractor fraud in U.S. history. The discovery that would finally explain why her husband, Marcus, had abandoned her for a successful defense contractor just 6 weeks after her grandfather's funeral in 2023, despite Sarah inheriting what appeared to be nothing more than a decrepit water tower on 40 acres of worthless farmland outside Billings, along with $85,000 in crushing medical debt from her grandfather's final illness. But her service dog Titan had been acting strangely around the tower from day one, refusing to approach it, whimpering when Sarah got too close, and displaying the same behavioral patterns he'd shown in Iraq when detecting hidden explosives and enemy combatants. What Titan had sensed would lead to the unraveling of a criminal conspiracy that had been targeting disabled veterans and their families for over a decade. Before we dive into this incredible story of betrayal, hidden military secrets, and ultimate justice, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and thank a veteran in your life. And if stories about ordinary people uncovering extraordinary conspiracies captivate you, make sure you're subscribed with notifications on, because tomorrow I've got an even more shocking story about a military widow who discovered her husband's training accident wasn't an accident at all. I'm Captain Sarah Brennan, and in August 2023, I was a 32-year-old disabled Army veteran living in Billings, Montana, desperately trying to rebuild my life after losing my right leg below the knee to an improvised explosive device during my second deployment to Iraq in 2019. The injury had ended what I thought would be a 20-year military career and left me dependent on disability benefits, occasional consulting work for veteran advocacy groups, and the unwavering support of my husband, Marcus, who had been my anchor through the darkest period of my life. My transformation from an active-duty infantry officer to a disabled civilian had been a brutal journey that no amount of military training could have prepared me for. The physical challenges of learning to walk again with a prosthetic leg were nothing compared to the psychological adjustment of losing not just my mobility, but my identity as a soldier, my sense of purpose, and my confidence.
But more importantly, Marcus had helped me discover new sources of purpose and identity during the dark months when I felt completely lost and useless after leaving the Army. He had supported my decision to start a small consulting business, helping other disabled veterans navigate the complex disability claims process, understanding that I needed to feel like I was still serving my fellow soldiers, even if I could no longer wear the uniform myself. My service dog, Titan, was a 3-year-old German Shepherd who had been specially trained through the Freedom Service Dogs organization to assist veterans with mobility issues and post-traumatic stress disorder. He had been assigned to me during my final months of recovery at Walter Reed Medical Center, and within weeks of our partnership beginning, he had become far more than just a medical accommodation. He was my partner, my early warning system, and often the only reason I could function in situations that triggered my anxiety or challenged my physical limitations. Titan's training had been extensive and specialized, focusing on the specific needs of combat veterans dealing with both physical disabilities and psychological trauma. He could detect the onset of panic attacks before I was even aware they were happening, providing deep pressure therapy by leaning his full weight against my legs or chest and implementing grounding techniques that could prevent full episodes from developing. He could sense changes in my balance and gait that might indicate fatigue or problems with my prosthetic fit, positioning himself to provide stability when I needed support or alerting me to rest before minor issues became dangerous falls. But most remarkably, Titan possessed an almost supernatural ability to detect threats and dangerous situations that went far beyond his official training curriculum. During our deployment together in Iraq, military working dogs like Titan had saved countless lives by detecting hidden explosives, identifying enemy positions, and alerting troops to dangers that human senses couldn't perceive. Titan's nose could detect chemical signatures from hundreds of yards away. His hearing could pick up sounds that were inaudible to humans, and his behavioral patterns had become so familiar to me that I could read his alerts like a sophisticated early warning system. The bond between a soldier and a military working dog is unlike any other relationship in the armed forces. These dogs aren't pets or mascots. They're highly trained specialists whose abilities can mean the difference between life and death for entire units. Titan had been with me during some of the most dangerous missions of my deployment, detecting roadside bombs that would have destroyed our vehicles, alerting us to enemy movements that preceded ambush attempts, and providing the kind of situational awareness that kept my soldiers alive during operations in hostile territory. In civilian life, these abilities had proven invaluable for managing the challenges of living with both physical disabilities and post-traumatic stress disorder. Titan could sense when crowded spaces or unexpected noises were triggering my anxiety, positioning himself between me and potential stressors before I even realized I was becoming overwhelmed. He could detect changes in my physical condition that might indicate problems with my prosthetic fit, or signs of overexertion that could lead to falls or injuries that would set back my recovery progress. Our daily routine in Billings had been carefully structured to accommodate my disabilities while allowing me to rebuild confidence and independence that my injury had initially destroyed. Marcus would leave for work each morning around 7, and I would spend my days working with veteran clients, conducting research for disability appeals, and managing the administrative aspects of the small consulting business I had established to help other disabled veterans navigate the complex bureaucratic systems that stood between them and the benefits they had earned through their service. The consulting work had become more than just a source of supplemental income. It was a lifeline that connected me to my sense of purpose and identity as a soldier who took care of other soldiers. Many of my clients were dealing with invisible injuries, like traumatic brain injuries or post-traumatic stress disorder, that were difficult to document and prove to the satisfaction of disability reviewers who had never served in combat zones and couldn't understand the complex ways that psychological trauma affected daily functioning and employment capabilities. Others were facing physical disabilities similar to my own, struggling to adapt to prosthetics or mobility aids while fighting insurance companies and government agencies for coverage of necessary equipment and treatments. The Department of Veterans Affairs disability system, while well-intentioned, was often slow, bureaucratic, and staffed by personnel who lacked the military experience necessary to properly evaluate claims related to combat injuries and service-connected conditions. Each successful case felt like a small victory, not only for my clients, but also for my own sense of self-worth and contribution to the veteran community. When a fellow soldier received approved benefits that would enable them to support their family or access medical care they desperately needed, it reminded me that my service hadn't ended with my injury. It had simply taken a different form that was equally important and meaningful.
The work required extensive research into medical documentation, military service records, and legal precedents that governed disability determinations. I had taught myself to navigate complex databases of military regulations, disability rating criteria, and appeals procedures that most veterans found overwhelming and incomprehensible. My military background gave me credibility with clients who had been frustrated by civilian advocates who didn't understand military culture or the specific nature of combat-related injuries. Marcus had been incredibly supportive of my dedication to this work, understanding that helping other veterans wasn't just a job for me, but a calling that provided psychological healing and restoration of the sense of identity and purpose that my injury had threatened to destroy permanently. He never complained when I worked late nights preparing appeals for difficult cases or spent weekends researching legal precedents that might help veterans who had been denied benefits multiple times. Our marriage had not only survived the trauma of my injury and the difficult transition to civilian life, but it had actually grown stronger through the challenges we had faced together. We had learned to communicate more effectively about difficult topics, developed deeper appreciation for each other's strengths and the support we provided during vulnerable moments, and built the kind of partnership that could weather serious crises without breaking apart. The financial aspects of our marriage had required significant adjustment after my injury. My military pay as an infantry captain had been supplemented by combat pay and various allowances that provided a comfortable standard of living, but my disability benefits, while adequate for basic needs, represented a substantial reduction in our household income. Marcus's construction management salary had become our primary source of financial stability, while my consulting business generated enough additional income to cover my medical expenses and provide modest savings for future goals. We had purchased our small two-bedroom house in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of Billings using a VA home loan, taking advantage of the benefits I had earned through military service to secure affordable housing that accommodated my mobility needs. The house had been modified with ramps, wider doorways, and bathroom fixtures that made daily activities manageable with my prosthetic leg, changes that had been partially covered by VA vocational rehabilitation funding. Our social life had necessarily changed after my injury, as many activities that had been routine before my deployment were no longer feasible or enjoyable, given my physical limitations and psychological triggers. Large crowds, loud noises, and unpredictable situations could trigger panic attacks or anxiety responses that made social gatherings difficult to navigate. But Marcus had been patient and creative about finding activities we could enjoy together, from quiet dinners at home to hiking on accessible trails where Titan could provide support if needed. By the summer of 2023, I felt like we had successfully navigated the worst challenges associated with my disability and were building a stable, purposeful life that honored both my military service and my current limitations. My consulting business was profitable enough to provide meaningful supplemental income and professional satisfaction. My physical therapy had progressed to the point where I could manage most daily activities independently, and my relationship with Marcus seemed stronger and more committed than ever before. But this sense of stability and security was about to be completely shattered by events that began with a phone call on a Tuesday morning in July 2023, just as I was preparing to meet with a new client whose disability claim had been denied 3 times, despite clear evidence of service-related traumatic brain injury that had left him unable to maintain steady employment. The call came from Patricia Whitmore, a partner with Whitmore and Associates law firm in Bozeman, who specialized in estate planning and probate proceedings throughout Montana. She was handling the estate settlement for my grandfather, Thomas Brennan, a man who had played a complicated and distant role in my life, but who had apparently made decisions about his inheritance that would soon consume every aspect of my family's stability and security. "Mrs. Brennan, I'm calling about your grandfather's estate," Patricia Whitmore explained in the carefully neutral tone that lawyers use when delivering news that might be either positive or problematic. "Thomas Brennan passed away last Thursday from complications related to pneumonia. I'm sorry to inform you of his death, and I need to schedule a meeting to discuss the inheritance arrangements that he specified in his will." My grandfather, Thomas, or Tom Brennan, had been a rancher who owned 40 acres of grazing land about 30 miles outside Billings, along with an old water tower that had been constructed in the 1960s to service irrigation systems for crops that he had stopped growing decades ago when changing economic conditions made small-scale farming unprofitable in the region. He was a tough, independent man who had served as a combat engineer in the Korean War and had spent his entire civilian life working the same piece of land that his father had purchased using benefits from the GI Bill after World War II.
My relationship with Grandpa Tom had been complicated and distant throughout my adult life, characterized by mutual respect but limited emotional connection or regular communication. He was proud of my military service in the abstract sense that all veterans appreciate when family members choose to serve their country, but he was also uncomfortable with emotional expressions or family gatherings that involved too much personal conversation or physical affection that might be interpreted as weakness or sentimentality. Grandpa Tom belonged to the generation of veterans who had returned from Korea with psychological wounds that were never acknowledged or treated, men who had learned to compartmentalize their trauma and focus on practical concerns like work, family responsibilities, and building the kind of stable civilian lives that justified the sacrifices they had made during their military service. He had little patience for what he considered self-pity or excessive discussion of problems that couldn't be solved through hard work and personal discipline. After my injury, Grandpa Tom had visited me exactly once during my hospitalization at Walter Reed, staying for precisely 20 minutes and saying very little beyond expressing his opinion that I would figure out how to deal with this situation because Brennan women are tough and don't quit when things get difficult. He had sent a card when I was discharged and had occasionally called to check on my recovery progress, but our conversations never lasted more than 5 minutes and rarely included anything more personal than updates about weather conditions and the challenges of maintaining ranch operations at his advanced age. Despite our limited relationship, I had always respected Grandpa Tom's independence and his commitment to maintaining the family land that represented over 70 years of continuous ownership and agricultural use. He had never married after my grandmother's death 15 years earlier, choosing to live alone in the small ranch house and manage the property with minimal outside assistance despite increasing physical limitations that made the work difficult and potentially dangerous for a man approaching his 90th birthday. The meeting with Patricia Whitmore 3 days after Grandpa Tom's funeral was held in her law office in downtown Bozeman, a 2-hour drive from Billings that Marcus and I made together because we both understood that inheritance matters could be complicated and that I might need emotional support depending on what the estate arrangements revealed about my grandfather's intentions and the practical implications of whatever he had decided to leave to various family members. The news that Grandpa Tom had named me as his primary beneficiary was shocking and unexpected given our limited relationship and the fact that he had other family members, including my father's brother and several cousins, who had maintained more regular contact with him over the years and who seemed more likely candidates for inheriting property that represented the family's agricultural heritage and historical connection to the land. But as Patricia Whitmore began explaining the details of the inheritance, it became apparent that Grandpa Tom's decision to leave the ranch to me came with significant complications that would make the bequest more problematic than beneficial, at least in the immediate term, and possibly for the foreseeable future depending on how we chose to handle the responsibilities and obligations that came with ownership of the property. The 40 acres of ranch land were appraised at approximately $120,000 according to current market assessments for agricultural property in the region, but the land had not been actively farmed or used for livestock grazing for over 10 years, and the infrastructure necessary for profitable agricultural use had deteriorated to the point where substantial investments would be required to make the property suitable for generating any kind of meaningful income. The irrigation systems that had once supported crop production were non-functional, with pumps, pipes, and control systems that would need to be completely replaced at a cost that could easily exceed $20,000. The fencing that defined property boundaries and separated different grazing areas had not been maintained and would require extensive repair or replacement before the land could be used for livestock operations. Most problematically, the old water tower that dominated the landscape and served as the most visible landmark on the property was considered a significant liability rather than an asset. The structure, which rose nearly 60 feet above the surrounding countryside and contained a 100,000-gallon storage tank, had not been inspected or maintained for over 20 years and would likely require either expensive repairs to meet current safety and environmental regulations or costly removal that could involve specialized equipment and environmental remediation if the tank contained residual chemicals or contaminants. But the physical challenges of managing the inherited property were only part of the problem that Grandpa Tom's death had created for my family's financial stability. His final years had involved substantial medical expenses related to multiple hospitalizations, nursing care, and prescription medications that had exhausted his savings and resulted in outstanding debts that would now become my responsibility as the inheritor of his estate.
The total debt load that came with the inheritance included $45,000 in unpaid medical bills from his final illness, including hospital charges, physician fees, and costs for medical equipment and home health services that had not been covered by Medicare or his supplemental insurance policies. An additional $18,000 in delinquent property taxes had been accumulating for 3 years, along with penalties and interest charges that continued to grow until the amounts were paid in full. Various credit accounts, utility bills, and other obligations added another $22,000 to the inherited debt burden, bringing the total financial liability to $85,000 that would need to be resolved before any benefits from the property inheritance could be realized. Even if we could sell the land for its full appraised value of $120,000, the net proceeds after paying inherited debts would be only $35,000, and that calculation assumed we could find a buyer willing to purchase property that came with a potentially dangerous water tower and infrastructure problems that most investors would consider deal breakers. Mrs. Brennan, Patricia Whitmore explained while reviewing estate documents that seemed to contain nothing but financial obligations and maintenance problems. Your grandfather's property has potential value, but the outstanding debts and infrastructure requirements mean that inheriting this estate will likely require significant financial investment before you could realize any benefit from the land or structures. You do have the option to disclaim the inheritance entirely if you determine that the liabilities exceed the potential benefits. Marcus's reaction to the inheritance news reflected the same practical concerns that I was beginning to appreciate as we reviewed the documentation and tried to understand our legal obligations and financial exposure. He had asked detailed questions during the meeting with the estate attorney, focusing particularly on our options for managing or disposing of the inherited debts and the timeline requirements for making decisions about accepting or disclaiming the inheritance. "Sarah, this inheritance is going to cost us money we don't have," Marcus said during our drive back to Billings after the meeting with Patricia Whitmore. "We're already managing your medical expenses and the overhead costs for your consulting business. Taking on $85,000 in debt for 40 acres of problematic land doesn't make financial sense when we're trying to build stability and maybe start thinking about buying a larger house or starting a family." His concerns were completely reasonable and reflected the same cost-benefit analysis that any responsible financial planner would recommend when evaluating whether to accept an inheritance that came with substantial liabilities and uncertain prospects for generating offsetting benefits. We were not in a financial position to assume additional debt, particularly debt associated with property that would require ongoing maintenance and management without providing any obvious path to profitable disposal or productive use. But despite the logical arguments for disclaiming the inheritance, something about Grandpa Tom's decision to leave the property to me felt significant in ways that I couldn't clearly articulate or defend using purely financial reasoning. He had not been sentimental or impulsive in his decision-making throughout the 70-plus years that I had known him, and his choice to burden me with this problematic inheritance suggested that he believed I would understand or appreciate something about the land and its structures that other family members might not recognize or value appropriately. Moreover, my military background had taught me to be suspicious of situations that seemed too straightforward or obvious, particularly when the surface assessment of a situation dismissed potentially valuable assets or strategic advantages without thorough investigation. The estate attorney's conclusion that the water tower was nothing more than an expensive liability seemed to reflect assumptions about the structure's condition and contents that might not be accurate without proper inspection and evaluation. But as Marcus and I spent the following weeks discussing our options and trying to develop a plan for managing the inheritance that would minimize our financial risk while fulfilling whatever legal obligations we had assumed, it became increasingly apparent that we had fundamentally different perspectives on the situation and different priorities for our family's financial planning and risk tolerance. The conversations about the inheritance revealed underlying tensions in our marriage that I had not previously recognized. Differences in our approaches to decision-making and our willingness to accept uncertainty in pursuit of potentially greater long-term benefits. Marcus favored practical, conservative solutions that prioritized immediate financial security over speculative possibilities, while I found myself drawn to the mystery and potential that the inheritance represented, despite the obvious risks and complications involved. But during this period of marital stress and financial uncertainty, Titan began displaying behaviors around the inherited property that would eventually prove far more significant than any of the legal and economic issues we were debating. From the moment we first visited the ranch to assess its condition and determine our options for managing or disposing of the problematic inheritance, Titan's reaction to the water tower was unlike anything I had observed in our 3 years of partnership.
His behavior around the massive structure was identical to the alerts he had provided in Iraq when detecting hidden explosives, enemy positions, or other threats that required immediate attention and careful investigation before proceeding with planned operations. The implications of Titan's alerts were disturbing and suggested that our inherited water tower contained something far more significant and potentially dangerous than the obsolete irrigation equipment that everyone assumed represented the full extent of its contents and importance. The systematic deterioration of my marriage began in September 2023, just 6 weeks after I had inherited Grandpa Tom's problematic ranch property, when Marcus started exhibiting behavioral changes that I initially attributed to the financial stress and uncertainty created by our inheritance situation. What I didn't understand at the time was that these changes were actually symptoms of a carefully orchestrated recruitment process that had been targeting our family for months before Grandpa Tom's death, conducted by people who possessed sophisticated knowledge of our personal circumstances and detailed understanding of the psychological pressure points that could be exploited to manipulate our decision-making about the inherited property. The first signs of trouble appeared as subtle shifts in Marcus's daily routines and communication patterns that were almost impossible to detect without the kind of situational awareness training that my military background had provided. He began working longer hours without clear explanations for the additional time requirements, claiming that his construction projects required more extensive planning and coordination than usual due to complications with government contracts and regulatory compliance issues that I had no reason to question or investigate. "Sarah, the federal contracting requirements are getting more complex every year," Marcus explained one evening when I asked about his third consecutive 60-hour work week. "The Department of Defense has implemented new security protocols for base construction projects that require additional documentation and coordination with multiple agencies. It's frustrating, but the overtime pay will help us manage the financial pressure from your grandfather's estate debts." His explanations seemed reasonable and consistent with the bureaucratic complications that I remembered from my own military experience dealing with government contractors and procurement processes.
Defense Department construction projects were notoriously complex and time-consuming, involving multiple layers of security clearances, environmental assessments, and regulatory approvals that could create legitimate reasons for extended work schedules and additional planning meetings. But as September progressed into October, Marcus's extended work schedule began to include evening meetings and weekend consultations that seemed unusual even for complicated government projects. He would receive phone calls during dinner or family time from people he described as project coordinators and compliance specialists who needed to discuss technical specifications or regulatory requirements that couldn't be addressed during normal business hours. "Marcus, who are these people who keep calling you at 8 o'clock at night?" I asked, after his phone had interrupted our dinner for the third time in 1 week. Government contracting may be complex, but it's not typically a 24-hour emergency operation. "Sarah, these are specialized consultants who work with multiple contractors across different time zones. They coordinate with federal agencies and military installations throughout the region, so their schedules don't follow normal business hours. It's just part of work in high-priority government projects." His responses to my questions about these late-night consultations became increasingly vague and defensive, suggesting either that he was dealing with legitimately sensitive information that he couldn't discuss in detail, or that something about these supposed business relationships was not as straightforward as he was claiming. My military background had taught me to be suspicious of explanations that seemed designed to discourage further questions rather than provide actual information about operational requirements and procedures. Moreover, Marcus had never previously been secretive or evasive about his work responsibilities. Throughout our marriage, he had freely discussed the challenges and details of his construction projects, often seeking my input on problem-solving approaches or sharing interesting aspects of the engineering and logistics challenges involved in building facilities under difficult conditions. His sudden reluctance to provide specific information about his current projects represented a significant departure from our normal communication patterns. The phone calls were accompanied by changes in Marcus's mood and energy levels that seemed inconsistent with simple work-related stress. He would return from his extended workdays in unusually good spirits, displaying optimism and confidence about our financial future that seemed disconnected from the reality of our inheritance problems and the mounting pressure to make decisions about Grandpa Tom's estate that we couldn't afford to implement.
"Sarah, I've been thinking about our situation with the ranch property, and maybe we're approaching this problem from the wrong perspective," Marcus said one evening while I was reviewing disability appeal documentation for a client whose traumatic brain injury claim had been denied despite overwhelming medical evidence. "What if there are people who specialize in exactly these kinds of complicated inheritance situations? People who understand property development and debt restructuring in ways that could turn this liability into an actual asset?" "Marcus, estate planning attorneys and financial advisors already exist for these purposes," I replied while continuing to work on my client's case. "We've consulted with professionals who understand inheritance law and property management. The problem isn't lack of expertise, it's that the property comes with more liabilities than assets, and we don't have the capital necessary to invest in the improvements that would be required to make it profitable." "But what if there were people with access to investment capital and development expertise who could take on the property as a partnership arrangement?" Marcus continued, his tone suggesting that he had been giving this possibility serious thought rather than simply brainstorming potential solutions. "People who could handle the debt obligations and infrastructure improvements in exchange for shared ownership or profit participation." His suggestions about mysterious specialists and development experts who could somehow solve our inheritance problems through unconventional financial arrangements struck me as potentially unrealistic or even fraudulent, but I was so overwhelmed with my consulting work and the ongoing stress of managing our inheritance decision that I didn't investigate these ideas as thoroughly as my military training should have prompted me to do. What I didn't understand was that Marcus's sudden optimism about alternative solutions to our inheritance problems was based on detailed information and specific proposals that he had been receiving from his mysterious business consultants, people who possessed extensive knowledge about our financial situation and who had been providing him with solutions that seemed too good to be true because they were actually part of an elaborate criminal scheme designed to separate me from assets that they believed were far more valuable than the problematic ranch property that everyone assumed represented the full extent of my inheritance. The most disturbing aspect of Marcus's behavioral changes during this period was his evolving attitude toward Titan and the unusual reactions that my service dog had been displaying whenever we visited the inherited ranch property. From the beginning of our partnership, Marcus had been respectful and supportive of Titan's role in managing my disabilities, understanding that the dog's training and instincts were essential for my safety and psychological stability in ways that went far beyond simple companionship or emotional support. But as Titan's alerts around the water tower became more pronounced and consistent, Marcus began expressing skepticism about the significance of these behavioral patterns and suggesting that my interpretation of Titan's reactions might be influenced by post-traumatic stress or anxiety related to our financial pressures, rather than genuine threat detection that warranted serious investigation. "Sarah, Titan is reacting to the stress he's picking up from you, not to any actual danger around that old water tower," Marcus said during one of our visits to assess the property's condition and maintenance requirements. "You're projecting your anxiety about the inheritance situation onto his normal responses to an unfamiliar environment. Dogs are sensitive to their handler's emotional state, and he's probably just reflecting your own concerns about taking on this property." His dismissive attitude toward Titan's alerts was completely inconsistent with his previous respect for my service dog's abilities and training. Marcus had witnessed Titan's threat detection capabilities during situations where my dog's warnings had prevented injuries or dangerous situations that I might not have recognized without his assistance. He understood that Titan's behavioral patterns were based on extensive training and combat experience rather than simple emotional responses to environmental changes. Moreover, Titan's alerts around the water tower were distinctly different from his normal reactions to stressful or unfamiliar situations. When my service dog was responding to my emotional state or environmental stressors, his behavior involved positioning himself closer to me and providing calming pressure or redirection techniques. But his reactions to the water tower involved classic threat detection alerts, focused attention on specific areas, refusal to approach despite my commands, and vocalizations that indicated detection of something that warranted investigation rather than avoidance. "Marcus, Titan's behavior around that water tower is identical to his explosive detection alerts in Iraq. He's not reacting to my stress levels, he's detecting something specific about that structure that his training has taught him to identify as potentially dangerous or significant." "Sarah, you're reading too much into normal dog behavior because you want there to be something mysterious or valuable about this inheritance. Sometimes a rundown water tower is just a rundown water tower, and trying to find hidden meaning or value in your grandfather's problems isn't going to solve our financial situation."
But Marcus's skepticism about Titan's alerts was accompanied by subtle attempts to discourage me from conducting detailed inspections of the water tower or investigating the specific aspects of the structure that were triggering my service dog's threat detection responses. He would suggest that climbing the tower might be dangerous given my prosthetic leg and mobility limitations, or that we should focus our limited time and energy on more practical aspects of property assessment, like evaluating the land's agricultural potential or researching local real estate market conditions. "Sarah, why are you so obsessed with that water tower when we haven't even properly assessed the land's value or potential uses?" Marcus asked during one visit, when I was attempting to examine the tower's access ladder and structural condition more thoroughly. "If we're going to make informed decisions about this inheritance, we should be focusing on the 40 acres of land that actually have development potential rather than wasting time on a structure that everyone agrees will need to be removed eventually anyway." This discouragement of my investigative efforts around the water tower seemed designed to redirect my attention toward aspects of the property that were more obviously problematic and less likely to reveal anything valuable or significant. But my military experience had taught me that when trained detection assets like Titan provided consistent alerts about specific targets, those alerts warranted thorough investigation, regardless of whether the significance was immediately apparent to human observers. The tension in our marriage continued to escalate throughout October 2023 as our different approaches to the inheritance situation revealed fundamental incompatibilities in our problem-solving styles and risk tolerance levels. Marcus favored quick, practical solutions that would minimize our exposure to the inherited debts and ongoing property management responsibilities, even if those solutions required accepting significant financial losses or abandoning potential opportunities that might not be immediately apparent. I found myself drawn to more thorough investigation and analysis of all aspects of the inheritance, including the mysterious elements like Titan's alerts and the inconsistencies I was beginning to notice between the official descriptions of the property and what I was observing during our visits. My military experience had taught me that when trained detection assets like Titan provided consistent alerts about specific targets, those alerts warranted thorough investigation, regardless of whether the significance was immediately apparent to human observers. These different approaches to risk assessment and decision-making were creating increasingly frequent arguments that went beyond simple disagreements about the inheritance to reveal deeper conflicts about our marriage's direction and our compatibility as partners facing complex challenges that required sustained cooperation and mutual support. Sarah, your military background is making you paranoid about situations that don't require tactical analysis and threat assessment, Marcus said during one particularly heated discussion about our timeline for making final decisions about the estate. This is a simple financial problem that requires practical solutions, not an intelligence operation that needs extensive investigation and contingency planning. Marcus, my military background has taught me to gather complete information before making irreversible decisions that affect our family's future, I replied, while reviewing property records and tax assessments that I had been researching to better understand the inheritance's true implications. We're dealing with assets and liabilities that could affect our financial security for decades, and I don't think it's paranoid to want complete understanding of what we're accepting or rejecting. But our arguments about investigation methodology and decision-making timelines were accompanied by more disturbing changes in Marcus's behavior that suggested his opposition to thorough property evaluation might be motivated by factors that went beyond simple impatience or different risk assessment preferences. He began actively discouraging me from spending time at the ranch property, claiming that the extended visits were interfering with my consulting work and creating unnecessary stress that was affecting my recovery from the disabilities related to my military service. Sarah, you're spending more time driving to that ranch and obsessing over problems you can't solve than you are on the veterans who are depending on you with their disability appeals, Marcus pointed out during one of our discussions about time management and priorities. Your clients are paying you for expertise and attention that you're diverting toward this inheritance situation that may not have any satisfactory resolution anyway. His observations about my time allocation were technically accurate but seemed designed to create guilt and pressure about priorities that would discourage me from continuing the investigations that were beginning to reveal inconsistencies and anomalies that warranted further examination. My consulting work with disabled veterans was indeed important and financially necessary, but the inheritance situation was a time-limited opportunity that required immediate attention before legal deadlines forced us into default decisions that might not serve our long-term interests.
The most troubling aspect of Marcus's changing behavior during this period was his introduction of alternative solutions to our inheritance problems that seemed to be based on information and resources that he had not previously mentioned, and that came from sources he was reluctant to identify specifically or discuss in detail. He began making references to people he had met through his construction work who possessed expertise in property development, debt restructuring, and investment partnerships that could potentially solve our inheritance problems through arrangements that wouldn't require us to assume personal financial liability for Grandpa Tom's debts. Sarah, there are people in the construction and development industry who specialize in taking on properties exactly like your grandfather's ranch, Marcus explained during one dinner conversation. while I was trying to balance consulting work with inheritance research. They have access to capital and expertise that could handle the debt obligations and infrastructure improvements while providing us with profit participation or buyout options that would give us the benefits of the inheritance without the risks and ongoing management responsibilities. Marcus, who are these people? And how did they become aware of our inheritance situation? I asked, while reviewing documents that Patricia Whitmore had provided about our legal obligations and decision-making timelines. Estate planning and property development are specialized fields that don't typically overlap with general construction management. And I'm concerned about discussing our private financial situation with people whose qualifications and motivations we haven't thoroughly researched. They're professional investors and developers who work throughout Montana and the surrounding region. They understand the unique challenges of rural property development and have experience with the regulatory and financial issues that make these projects difficult for individual families to handle independently. But Marcus's reluctance to provide specific names, company information, or detailed credentials for these supposed development specialists raised red flags that my military intelligence training had taught me to recognize as indicators of potentially fraudulent or deceptive operations. Legitimate business professionals in regulated industries like construction and real estate development were typically eager to provide detailed information about their qualifications, previous projects, and business practices because transparency and accountability were essential for building trust with potential clients and partners. His vague references to unnamed specialists and investors who somehow learned about our inheritance situation and were offering solutions that seemed too convenient and comprehensive to be legitimate suggested that Marcus was either being deceived by people who were not what they claimed to be, or that he was deliberately withholding information about the source and nature of these supposed business opportunities. The situation became even more concerning in November 2023 when Marcus began receiving phone calls and text messages from these mysterious business contacts at increasingly inappropriate times and locations. He would step outside to take calls during our visits to the ranch property, conduct whispered conversations while I was working with clients in our home office, and excuse himself from social situations and family activities to respond to communications that he claimed were related to time-sensitive business opportunities that required immediate attention. Marcus, why are you taking business calls during our weekend visit to assess the property's boundary markers and fencing conditions? I asked, after he had stepped away from our work for the third time in 2 hours to conduct private conversations that he claimed were related to legitimate construction projects. If these calls are about your regular construction work, why can't you discuss them openly? And if they're about our inheritance situation, why am I not included in discussions about proposals that would affect our family's financial future? Sarah, these are preliminary discussions about potential partnership arrangements that may not develop into actual opportunities. There's no point in getting your hopes up or involving you in speculative conversations that might not lead to viable solutions for our inheritance problems. But his explanation for excluding me from discussions about our inheritance situation was completely inconsistent with the collaborative approach we had always used for important financial decisions throughout our marriage. Marcus had never previously made unilateral decisions about investments, major purchases, or financial planning without including me in the evaluation process and ensuring that we both understood and agreed with the risks and benefits of proposed actions. His sudden adoption of a paternalistic attitude about protecting me from speculative conversations that might affect our inheritance decisions suggested that either he was being manipulated by people who had advised him to limit my involvement in their proposals, or that he was deliberately concealing information about the source and nature of these supposed business opportunities that he believed I would find objectionable or concerning if I understood their true nature and implications.
The most disturbing development in Marcus's behavior during this period was his evolving attitude toward the inheritance decision itself and his increasing pressure for us to accept whatever solutions his mysterious business contacts were proposing,
rather than continuing the careful evaluation and investigation that I believed our situation required. He began expressing urgency about reaching final decisions that seemed inconsistent with the legal timelines that Patricia Whitmore had outlined for estate acceptance or disclosure procedures. "Sarah, we can't continue analyzing this inheritance situation indefinitely while the debts continue accumulating interest and penalties," Marcus said during one evening discussion about our progress toward reaching final decisions about the estate. "These business development specialists have offered to take over the entire situation and provide us with financial benefits without any risk or ongoing management responsibilities. We need to seriously consider accepting their proposal before the opportunity disappears." "Sarah, we haven't even seen a formal written proposal from these supposed specialists, and we don't have enough information about their qualifications or business practices to make informed decisions about partnership arrangements that could affect our financial security for decades," I replied, while reviewing additional research I had been conducting about property development regulations and partnership structures that could protect our interests if we decided to work with outside investors. "Sometimes you have to make decisions based on incomplete information and trust the expertise of people who understand industries and markets that are outside your own knowledge and experience," Marcus responded, with an impatience and condescension that were completely uncharacteristic of his normal communication style and problem-solving approach. His pressure for rapid decision-making about complex financial arrangements based on incomplete information from unverified sources represented such a dramatic departure from his normally cautious and methodical approach to important decisions that I began to suspect that his judgment was being influenced by factors that went beyond simple frustration with our inheritance situation. The most alarming aspect of this pressure was Marcus's suggestion that my reluctance to accept his business contact's proposals was evidence of psychological problems related to my military service and disability that were preventing me from making rational decisions about our family's financial future. He began characterizing my desire for thorough investigation and complete information as symptoms of paranoia and control issues that were creating unnecessary obstacles to resolving our inheritance problems. "Sarah, your military training has made you suspicious and paranoid about situations that require trust and cooperation with other people," Marcus said during one argument about our timeline for reaching final decisions about the estate. "You're treating this inheritance situation like a combat operation where everyone is potentially an enemy instead of a financial problem that requires working with qualified professionals who can provide solutions we can't develop independently." His characterization of my caution and investigatory approach as evidence of psychological dysfunction was not only personally hurtful, but also strategically dangerous, because it could potentially undermine my credibility if our inheritance situation required legal proceedings or professional mediation to resolve disputes about property management and debt obligations. Moreover, his attempts to pathologize my military training and analytical skills suggested that he was either being coached by people who understood how to manipulate family dynamics and decision-making processes, or that he had developed such a strong commitment to his mysterious business contact's proposals that he was willing to attack my competence and judgment to overcome my resistance to accepting arrangements that I couldn't properly evaluate. But the most significant development during this period of escalating marital tension and pressure about the inheritance decision was a series of incidents involving Titan that would eventually reveal the true nature of the threats and opportunities that our inheritance situation actually represented. My service dog's behavioral alerts around the water tower were becoming more pronounced and specific, providing information about the structure's contents and significance that went beyond general threat detection to suggest systematic investigation of particular areas and access points that warranted immediate and careful examination.
During one visit to the property in late November 2023, Titan's behavior around the base of the water tower became so focused and persistent that I decided to conduct a more thorough examination of the areas that were triggering his strongest alerts, despite Marcus's attempts to discourage this investigation and redirect my attention toward other aspects of the property assessment. What I discovered during this examination would transform my understanding not only of my inheritance's true value and significance, but also of the elaborate criminal conspiracy that had been targeting my family for months and that had been using Marcus's recruitment and manipulation as part of a sophisticated operation designed to steal assets worth hundreds of millions of dollars through psychological manipulation and legal fraud that had been perfected through similar attacks against other military families throughout the region.
The systematic destruction of everything I had believed about my marriage accelerated in December 2023 when Marcus's mysterious business consultations evolved from secretive phone conversations into overnight trips and multi-day conferences that removed him from our home for extended periods during the most critical phase of our inheritance decision-making process. What I initially attributed to the demanding requirements of his construction projects would eventually reveal itself as evidence of his active participation in a criminal conspiracy that had been monitoring our family's situation for over a year before Grandpa Tom's death. The first extended absence occurred during the second week of December when Marcus announced that he needed to attend a 3-day conference in Denver focused on federal construction contracting procedures and new regulatory compliance requirements that would affect his upcoming projects with military installations throughout the Rocky Mountain region. The conference explanation seemed legitimate and consistent with the professional development activities that construction managers in his field regularly attended to maintain certifications and stay current with evolving government requirements. Sarah, this Denver conference is mandatory for anyone working on Defense Department projects above certain dollar thresholds, Marcus explained while packing business clothes and materials that appeared consistent with attending professional development sessions. The new security protocols and environmental compliance standards are complex enough that contractors who don't complete this training will be excluded from future government bidding opportunities. But several aspects of this supposed professional development conference were inconsistent with the professional development events that Marcus had attended throughout our marriage. He was unusually secretive about the conference agenda, declining to share documentation or schedules that would normally be provided to attendees' employers for training record maintenance. He was also vague about the specific company or organization hosting the event, providing only general references to federal contractor certification programs without identifying the training provider or registration requirements that typically govern such specialized professional development opportunities. Most significantly, Marcus's demeanor about attending this conference was completely different from his normal attitude toward professional development activities. Throughout our marriage, he had generally regarded mandatory training sessions as tedious obligations that interfered with productive work time, approaching them with resigned professionalism rather than the anticipation and enthusiasm he was displaying about this particular event. So, Marcus, you seem unusually excited about attending what you've described as a mandatory compliance training session, I observed while helping him organize documents for the trip. Professional development conferences are important for career advancement, but you've never shown this level of enthusiasm about government contracting workshops before. This conference includes networking opportunities with development specialists and investment professionals who work throughout the Mountain West region. It's a chance to make connections that could be valuable for our situation with your grandfather's property and the partnership opportunities we've been discussing. His explanation confirmed my growing suspicion that this supposed professional development conference was actually related to the mysterious business consultants who had been influencing his thinking about our inheritance situation. The combination of federal contracting training with real estate development networking suggested either that the conference was not what Marcus was claiming it to be, or that he was using legitimate professional development activities as cover for pursuing business relationships that he preferred to keep separate from our normal decision-making processes. During Marcus's 3-day absence in Denver, I used the opportunity to conduct more systematic research into the business development specialists and investment partnership arrangements that he had been promoting as solutions to our inheritance problems. What I discovered through internet searches, professional database queries, and contacts within the veteran business community raised serious questions about the legitimacy and true intentions of the people who were apparently providing Marcus with advice about our financial situation. The generic company names and investment partnership structures that Marcus had mentioned in our conversations did not correspond to any registered businesses or professional organizations that I could locate through standard commercial databases or state regulatory filings. The specialized expertise in rural property development and estate debt restructuring that he had described seemed to be provided by entities that either didn't exist or were operating under different names and business structures than what he had indicated. More troubling, when I contacted other veterans in my professional network who had experience with property development and investment partnerships, none of them had heard of the specific companies or consultants that Marcus had referenced as sources of expertise for our inheritance situation. Several colleagues who specialized in veteran business development and financial planning expressed concern about partnership arrangements that involved taking over estate debts and property management responsibilities for families who are dealing with complicated inheritance situations.
Sarah, legitimate investment partnerships in rural property development are typically transparent about their business practices, previous projects, and regulatory compliance, explained Janet Morrison, a former Air Force officer who worked as a financial planner specializing in military families' investment and estate planning needs. Companies that are reluctant to provide detailed information about their qualifications and business practices are often involved in predatory lending, fraudulent investment schemes, or other operations that target families who are facing financial pressure and complex legal situations. Janet's warnings about predatory targeting of military families dealing with inheritance problems were consistent with my own growing concerns about Marcus's business contacts, but I was also aware that my suspicions might be influenced by the post-traumatic stress and control issues that he had been suggesting were affecting my judgment about our situation. However, my research efforts were interrupted by a series of incidents during Marcus's absence that would prove far more significant than my concerns about his business relationships. Titan's behavioral alerts around the inherited ranch property became dramatically more pronounced and specific during a solo visit I made to conduct additional property assessment while Marcus was attending his conference in Denver. Without Marcus present to discourage my investigative efforts or redirect my attention away from the water tower, I was able to conduct a more thorough examination of the areas that were triggering Titan's most consistent and intense alerts. What I discovered during this investigation challenged not only my assumptions about the property's contents and value, but also my understanding of Grandpa Tom's life and the true reason why criminal organizations had been targeting our family. The water tower's external ladder system, which appeared to be rusted and potentially unsafe from ground-level observation, was actually in much better condition than its cosmetic appearance suggested. The corrosion and deterioration that made the structure look abandoned and dangerous were primarily superficial damage that had been deliberately applied to disguise recent maintenance and structural improvements that kept the access systems fully functional despite their derelict appearance. When I climbed the ladder system with Titan's assistance and guidance, I discovered that the tower's access hatches and inspection ports had been modified with sophisticated locking mechanisms that were completely inconsistent with the basic agricultural equipment that the structure was supposed to contain. The locks were modern electronic systems that required specialized access codes or bypass procedures that suggested recent installation and ongoing maintenance by people with technical expertise far beyond what would be necessary for managing obsolete irrigation equipment.
But the most significant discovery came when I was able to gain access to the water tower's interior storage areas through an access panel that Titan had been consistently alerting on during our previous visits to the property. Instead of the empty tank or basic irrigation equipment that everyone had assumed comprised the tower's contents, I found evidence of sophisticated concealment systems and storage facilities that had been constructed within the structure to hide materials and equipment that were obviously valuable and potentially dangerous. The water tower's interior had been extensively modified to create multiple storage compartments and work areas that were completely hidden from external observation, but that provided substantial secure storage capacity for materials that required environmental protection and unauthorized access prevention. The modifications included climate control systems, security monitoring equipment, and communication infrastructure that suggested ongoing use and management by people who possessed significant technical expertise and financial resources. Most remarkably, the concealment systems included access points to underground facilities that extended far beyond the water tower's foundation into elaborate tunnel systems and storage bunkers that represented construction projects requiring substantial engineering expertise and investment capital that far exceeded what any individual rancher could have afforded or managed independently.
The scope and sophistication of the operation that Grandpa Tom had apparently been documenting and investigating far exceeded anything that individual criminals or small criminal organizations could have managed independently. The evidence suggested involvement by organized crime networks with extensive resources and capabilities, including corruption within military and government agencies that enabled systematic theft operations and international trafficking that had been continuing for decades without detection or prosecution. But the most shocking revelation in the underground documentation was evidence that Grandpa Tom had not been a participant in these criminal activities, but rather an undercover investigator who had been working with federal law enforcement agencies to gather evidence and intelligence about the criminal networks for over 20 years before his death. His modest lifestyle and apparent financial limitations had been elaborate cover for sophisticated intelligence-gathering operations that required him to maintain perfect disguise as an ordinary rancher while conducting dangerous surveillance and evidence collection activities. The federal investigation files that I discovered in the concealed storage areas revealed that Grandpa Tom had been a retired Army Criminal Investigation Division agent who had volunteered for undercover assignment targeting military equipment theft and trafficking operations after completing his official military service. His ranch property and agricultural activities had provided ideal cover for monitoring criminal operations throughout Montana and surrounding states, while gathering evidence that could eventually be used to destroy the criminal networks and recover stolen military assets. The investigation had been complicated by the fact that the criminal organizations possessed extensive resources and capabilities, including corruption within federal agencies and military institutions that made traditional law enforcement approaches ineffective and potentially dangerous for investigators and their families. The networks had been systematically targeting families with military backgrounds and financial vulnerabilities, using psychological manipulation and legal fraud to gain access to properties and assets that could be used for storage and distribution of stolen military equipment. But the most terrifying aspect of the federal investigation files was evidence that Grandpa Tom's death had not been the result of natural causes, as the official death certificate indicated, but rather had been the result of deliberate poisoning by criminal organization members who had discovered his undercover activities and eliminated him to prevent completion of the investigation that would have exposed their operations and led to prosecutions that could have destroyed their criminal empire. The murder had been designed to appear as natural death from pneumonia complications, using sophisticated toxins that mimicked the symptoms of respiratory illness
while avoiding detection through routine autopsy procedures. The timing of his death had been carefully planned to occur during the period when the federal investigation was approaching completion, and when law enforcement agencies were preparing to implement arrests and asset seizure operations that would have dismantled the criminal networks. Most significantly, the investigation files revealed that the criminal organizations had been systematically monitoring families of undercover investigators and potential witnesses, implementing recruitment and manipulation operations designed to gain access to evidence and assets through family members who were unaware of their relatives' involvement in federal investigations. The psychological manipulation tactics being used against these families were identical to the recruitment and marriage destruction operations that had been targeting my relationship with Marcus. The documentation included detailed profiles of military families throughout the region who had been targeted for recruitment operations, including extensive background information about family members' financial situations, personal vulnerabilities, and relationship dynamics that could be exploited to facilitate criminal access to properties and assets that contained evidence or stolen materials that the organizations needed to recover or control. My family's profile in these criminal intelligence files was extensive and detailed, including information about my military service, disability status, consulting business, and marriage relationship that had been gathered through surveillance operations that had been monitoring our activities for over 18 months before Grandpa Tom's death. The profile included assessments of Marcus's personality characteristics and psychological vulnerabilities that could be exploited to recruit him as an unwitting participant in operations designed to separate me from the inheritance that contained evidence capable of destroying the entire criminal network. The recruitment operation targeting Marcus had been professionally planned and implemented using sophisticated psychological manipulation techniques that had been developed and refined through similar operations against other military families throughout the region. The business consultants who had been providing him with advice about our inheritance situation were actually criminal organization operatives who specialized in manipulating family relationships and legal proceedings to gain access to assets and evidence that threatened their operations.
But the federal investigation files also revealed that law enforcement agencies had been monitoring the criminal organization's recruitment operations and were aware that our family was being targeted, but that they had been unable to provide direct protection or warning because the criminal networks possessed extensive surveillance capabilities and corruption within government agencies that made normal protective measures ineffective and potentially dangerous for the families involved. Instead, the federal agencies had been implementing covert protective operations designed to gather evidence about the criminal recruitment tactics while positioning resources for coordinated arrests and prosecutions that would occur when the criminal organizations committed overt crimes that could be prosecuted without compromising the ongoing investigation or endangering the families who were being targeted. The investigation files indicated that my discovery of the concealed evidence in underground facilities represented a critical development in the federal operation, providing law enforcement agencies with the opportunity to protect my family while gathering additional evidence about the criminal network's methods and capabilities that could be used to prosecute not only the immediate criminal operators, but also the corrupt officials and organizational leaders who had been facilitating the systematic theft and trafficking operations for decades. But the files also contained urgent warnings that my discovery of the concealed facilities and evidence would likely trigger immediate and desperate responses from the criminal organizations, who would recognize that their operations were facing imminent exposure and destruction and would likely resort to violence and intimidation tactics to prevent law enforcement access to the evidence and assets that I had inherited from Grandpa Tom's undercover investigation.
The most immediate danger involved Marcus's recruitment operation, which would likely escalate to more direct instruction and coordination than the subtle manipulation tactics that had characterized his previous interactions with his mysterious business consultants. "Sarah, I've learned about partnership opportunities that could solve all of our inheritance problems while providing substantial financial benefits for our family's future," Marcus announced with an enthusiasm and confidence that seemed completely disconnected from the complex legal and financial challenges that our situation actually involved. "The development specialists I met at the conference have reviewed our situation and are prepared to offer partnership arrangements that would eliminate our debt exposure while generating substantial profit participation that could transform our financial security permanently."
His claims about comprehensive solutions to our inheritance problems based on brief discussions with unnamed specialists at a conference that I was increasingly certain had not actually focused on federal contracting compliance suggested that he was either being systematically deceived about the nature of these business opportunities or that he was knowingly participating in fraudulent schemes while attempting to deceive me about their true nature and implications for our family's safety and security. But Marcus's enthusiasm about these supposed partnership opportunities was accompanied by urgent pressure for immediate decision-making and implementation that was completely inconsistent with the careful evaluation and legal consultation that legitimate business partnerships required, particularly partnerships involving complex inheritance situations and substantial financial obligations that could affect our family's security for decades. "Sarah? These opportunities are time-sensitive because the development specialists have multiple projects competing for their attention and investment capital," Marcus explained, while attempting to schedule meetings and site visits with people whose identities and qualifications he was still unwilling to specify in detail. "We need to make final decisions about accepting their proposals within the next few weeks, or they'll move on to other properties and partnerships that don't involve the complications and delays that our situation has been requiring." The pressure tactics and artificial urgency that Marcus was applying to force rapid acceptance of unknown partnership arrangements were identical to the manipulation techniques that the federal investigation files had identified as characteristic methods used by criminal organizations to prevent targets from conducting thorough evaluation and seeking independent professional advice that might reveal the fraudulent nature of the proposed business relationships. My discovery of Grandpa Tom's federal investigation evidence and the true nature of the criminal targeting that our family was experiencing had transformed my understanding of everything that had been happening to our marriage and financial situation during the previous 6 months. But it had also placed me in the impossible position of needing to protect evidence that could destroy criminal organizations while maintaining my relationship with a husband who had been recruited to help those same criminals gain access to the assets and information that they were desperate to control or destroy. The most terrifying aspect of my situation was the recognition that Marcus's recruitment had progressed to the point where he might already be committed to assisting criminal operations against our family's interests, either through deliberate cooperation with people he knew were criminals or through manipulation that had convinced him that he was helping legitimate business professionals solve our inheritance problems, while unknowingly facilitating criminal access to federal investigation evidence that could result in our deaths if the criminal organizations determined that we posed threats to their continued operations. The final confrontation with the criminal conspiracy targeting my family began on January 15, 2024, when I made the decision to contact FBI Special Agent Rebecca Martinez, whose business card I had found among Grandpa Tom's federal investigation files, along with explicit instructions to reach out to her if I discovered the concealed evidence and faced immediate threats from the criminal organizations that had murdered him to prevent completion of his 20-year undercover operation. Agent Martinez's response to my contact was immediate and comprehensive, confirming not only that federal agencies had been monitoring the criminal targeting of my family, but also that they had been preparing coordinated operations to protect me while gathering additional evidence about the criminal network's recruitment and manipulation tactics that could be used to prosecute the entire organization, from street-level operators to corrupt government officials who had been facilitating systematic theft from military installations for decades. Mrs. Brennan,
Your grandfather was one of the most effective undercover investigators in federal law enforcement history, Agent Martinez explained during our first secure communication session. His evidence and intelligence gathering has provided us with the foundation for prosecuting criminal organizations that have stolen over $400 million in military equipment and classified materials while targeting dozens of military families throughout the western United States. Your discovery of his concealed files and evidence represents the final piece we needed to begin arrests and asset seizure operations that will destroy these networks permanently. But Agent Martinez also confirmed my worst fears about the immediate dangers that my family was facing as a result of my inheritance discovery and Marcus's recruitment by criminal operatives who were becoming increasingly desperate as they recognized that their operations were facing imminent exposure and prosecution. The criminal organization targeting your family has been monitoring your activities and communication patterns through surveillance equipment and electronic intercepts that enable them to track your movements and conversations in real time, she warned, while explaining the security protocols that federal agencies would implement to protect my safety, while gathering additional evidence about the recruitment operations. They're aware that you've accessed your grandfather's concealed files, and they're likely to escalate their manipulation and pressure tactics against your husband to force immediate access to the evidence and assets before we can implement protective measures.
The federal protection operation required me to continue normal routines and interactions with Marcus while wearing recording equipment and following security protocols that would enable law enforcement agents to gather evidence about the criminal recruitment tactics while positioning resources for coordinated arrests when the criminal operators committed overt crimes that could be prosecuted without compromising the ongoing investigation. The most difficult aspect of this undercover cooperation was maintaining normal marriage interactions with Marcus while knowing that he had been recruited by criminals who were prepared to kill to protect operations that generated hundreds of millions of dollars annually through systematic theft from the military institutions that I had served and that continued to serve our country. Every conversation about our inheritance situation and financial planning was now a potential intelligence gathering opportunity that could either protect other military families or endanger my own safety if Marcus's criminal contacts detected my cooperation with federal investigators. The escalation I had been warned to expect began within 48 hours of my initial contact with Agent Martinez when Marcus returned from another supposed business trip with urgent demands for immediate meetings with his development specialists and pressure for me to sign legal documents that would transfer control of the inherited property to partnership arrangements that he claimed were necessary to protect our family from bankruptcy and legal liability associated with Grandpa Tom's estate debts. Sarah, the partnership agreements are time-critical because regulatory changes scheduled for February will affect the tax advantages and liability protections that these development specialists can provide, Marcus explained while presenting documents that appeared professional and comprehensive, but that contained legal language and ownership transfer provisions that would effectively surrender all control of the inherited property to shell companies controlled by the criminal organization, but they had been prepared with enough legitimate legal language and official-appearing formatting to deceive people who weren't familiar with property law and inheritance regulations. Marcus, these partnership documents transfer complete ownership and control of inherited assets to companies whose business practices and legal qualifications we haven't independently verified, I replied while reviewing the agreements with assistance from Agent Martinez and federal prosecutors who were analyzing the documents for evidence of the fraud and conspiracy charges that would be used to prosecute the criminal network. Legitimate business partnerships don't require immediate signature on complex legal agreements without allowing time for independent legal consultation and due diligence evaluation. But Marcus's response to my reasonable concerns about the partnership agreements revealed the extent to which his recruitment and manipulation had progressed beyond subtle psychological pressure to direct instruction and coordination with criminal operatives who were no longer attempting to maintain the pretense that their proposals represented legitimate business opportunities. Marcus, your military background has made you paranoid and suspicious about business relationships that require trust and cooperation, Marcus said with anger and frustration that seemed completely disproportionate to my request for additional time to review complex legal agreements. These development specialists have invested substantial time and resources in evaluating our situation and preparing solutions that could transform our financial security, and your refusal to accept their proposals is preventing our family from accessing opportunities that won't be available if we continue delaying decisions about partnership implementation. His characterization of my caution about signing unknown legal documents as evidence of psychological problems related to my military service represented a significant escalation in the manipulation tactics that his criminal contacts had been teaching him to use against me. The gaslighting approach was designed to undermine my confidence in my own judgment while creating pressure to accept partnership arrangements I couldn't properly evaluate or understand. But the most disturbing aspect of his pressure campaign was his introduction of veiled threats about the consequences of continued resistance to the partnership proposals, suggestions that the development specialists were becoming impatient with our delays and might withdraw their offers or pursue alternative approaches to accessing the inherited property that could be more problematic for our family's safety and financial security. Sarah, these people have been extremely patient with your concerns and investigation requirements, but they're not going to wait indefinitely for you to overcome your paranoia about accepting professional help, Marcus warned during one particularly tense conversation about the partnership documents. They have other properties and investment opportunities that don't involve the complications and delays that your attitude has been creating, and if we don't finalize these arrangements soon, they might decide that working with our family isn't worth the effort and expense they've already invested.
The implicit threats contained in Marcus's warnings about the development specialist's patience and alternative approaches were actually direct communications from criminal operatives who were becoming increasingly desperate as they recognized that their recruitment operation was failing to achieve rapid access to the evidence and assets they needed to protect their criminal enterprise from federal prosecution. Agent Martinez and her federal task force had been monitoring all of Marcus's communications and meetings with the criminal operatives, gathering evidence about their recruitment tactics, organizational structure, and the scope of their criminal operations that would be used to prosecute not only the immediate conspirators, but also the corrupt officials and organizational leaders who had been facilitating systematic theft and trafficking operations throughout multiple states. The federal investigation had identified 12 primary conspirators involved in the military equipment theft and trafficking operation, including 3 current military personnel, 2 defense contractor employees, and 7 civilian operatives who specialized in recruitment and manipulation of military families for access to properties and assets that could be used for storage and distribution of stolen materials. But the most significant breakthrough in the federal investigation came when Marcus's criminal contacts finally abandoned subtle manipulation tactics and resorted to direct threats and intimidation that provided clear evidence of criminal conspiracy and extortion that could be prosecuted without compromising the ongoing intelligence-gathering operations against the larger criminal network. The confrontation occurred on February 3, 2024, when Marcus arranged a meeting at our home with 2 of his supposed development specialists who arrived with legal documents, financial projections, and partnership proposals that they claimed represented final offers that required immediate acceptance or rejection without additional delay or consultation. Mrs. Brennan, we've invested substantial time and resources in evaluating your inheritance situation and developing solutions that could provide significant financial benefits for your family, explained David Kellerman, who introduced himself as a senior partner in a regional development consortium, but whose background investigation by federal agents had revealed extensive criminal history, including fraud, extortion, and violence against families who had resisted criminal recruitment operations. Our partnership proposals represent comprehensive solutions to the debt and liability problems associated with your inherited property, but these arrangements are time-sensitive because of regulatory changes and other investment opportunities that require our immediate attention and resource allocation, added his associate, Victoria Castellanos, whose criminal background included specialized expertise in legal document forgery and psychological manipulation of military families dealing with inheritance and financial crisis situations. But Kellerman and Castellanos had made a critical mistake by conducting their recruitment operation at my home, where federal agents had installed sophisticated surveillance equipment that recorded every aspect of their presentation and revealed the true nature of their criminal enterprise when their patience with my continued resistance finally expired and they resorted to direct threats and intimidation tactics. Mrs. Brennan, your husband has explained that you're having difficulty understanding the benefits and urgency of our partnership proposals, Kellerman said when I continued asking questions about the legal documents and requesting additional time for independent consultation with estate planning attorneys. We're prepared to provide substantial financial compensation for immediate access to your inherited property, but we're not prepared to continue these negotiations indefinitely while you overcome whatever psychological issues are preventing you from making rational business decisions. The threats escalated rapidly when Castellanos began making specific references to my disability status, my business consulting clients, and my family's daily routines and security vulnerabilities that revealed extensive surveillance and intelligence gathering that went far beyond what legitimate business professionals would conduct when evaluating potential partnership opportunities. Mrs. Brennan, we understand that your military service and disability situation have created financial pressures and decision-making challenges that affect your family's security and stability, Castellanos said while reviewing documents that contain detailed information about my medical records, business finances, and personal relationships that could only have been obtained through illegal surveillance and information-gathering operations. We're prepared to address all of these concerns through partnership arrangements that would provide comprehensive financial security and protection for you and your family. But these arrangements require immediate implementation before other parties become involved in your inheritance situation. The references to other parties becoming involved in my inheritance situation were direct threats related to my cooperation with federal investigators, confirming that the criminal organization had detected my contact with law enforcement agencies and was attempting to force immediate compliance with their demands before arrests and prosecutions could be implemented.
But Kellerman and Castellanos had provided federal agents with exactly the evidence they needed to move beyond surveillance and intelligence gathering to immediate arrests and prosecution of the entire criminal network. Their direct threats, document forgery, and admitted surveillance of my family constituted multiple federal crimes that could be prosecuted immediately while protecting other ongoing investigations into the broader criminal organization. The arrests began at 6:47 a.m. on February 4, 2024, with coordinated raids at 17 locations throughout Montana, Wyoming, Colorado, and North Dakota that resulted in the detention of 43 suspects and the seizure of over $280 million in stolen military equipment, classified documents, and criminal proceeds that had been accumulated through 25 years of systematic theft and trafficking operations. Kellerman and Castellanos were arrested at a hotel in Billings where they had been preparing to implement direct intimidation and violence against my family if I continued refusing to surrender control of the inherited evidence and assets. Their hotel room contained weapons, surveillance equipment, and detailed plans for kidnapping and assassination operations that would have been implemented if their recruitment and manipulation tactics had continued failing to achieve access to Grandpa Tom's federal investigation files. Marcus was arrested at his workplace, where federal agents had been monitoring his communications and activities for weeks while gathering evidence about his level of knowledge and voluntary participation in the criminal conspiracy. The investigation revealed that he had been systematically deceived about the true nature of his contact's business activities and had been manipulated through psychological pressure and financial incentives rather than being a knowing participant in criminal operations against our family. Mrs. Brennan, your husband was a victim of sophisticated recruitment and manipulation tactics rather than a voluntary participant in criminal activities, Agent Martinez explained during the debriefing sessions that followed the arrests. The criminal organization specifically targeted him because of his access to your family and his psychological vulnerabilities related to financial pressure and career advancement concerns. His cooperation with their recruitment operation was the result of deception and manipulation rather than criminal intent. But despite Marcus's status as a victim rather than a criminal conspirator, the damage to our marriage was irreparable. The months of deception, manipulation, and psychological pressure had destroyed the trust and communication that had formed the foundation of our relationship, and the revelation that he had been systematically lying about his activities and intentions had created emotional wounds that couldn't be healed through criminal prosecution of the people who had manipulated him. The divorce proceedings were completed in August 2024, with custody arrangements that protected our family relationships while acknowledging that Marcus's recruitment and manipulation had created safety and security concerns that required ongoing monitoring and protective measures. He received counseling and support services for victims of criminal recruitment operations, but the psychological damage from his participation in activities that had endangered our family's safety was too extensive for our marriage to survive. The federal prosecution of the military equipment theft and trafficking conspiracy resulted in convictions for all 43 defendants, with sentences ranging from 15 years for lower-level operatives to life imprisonment for organizational leaders who had been responsible for murder and systematic corruption of government officials. Asset forfeiture proceedings recovered over $400 million in stolen property and criminal proceeds, with substantial portions being returned to military installations and defense contractors who had been victimized by the theft operations. But the most significant outcome of the investigation was the identification and prosecution of corrupt officials within military and government agencies who had been facilitating the criminal operations for decades. 17 current and former government employees were convicted of conspiracy, bribery, and treason charges that resulted in lengthy prison sentences and the implementation of enhanced security protocols that would prevent similar criminal penetration of military institutions and defense contractors. My role in exposing and prosecuting the criminal conspiracy was recognized through multiple awards and commendations from military and law enforcement agencies. But the most meaningful recognition came from the dozens of military families who had been targeted by similar recruitment and manipulation operations and who were protected from criminal victimization through the intelligence and evidence that Grandpa Tom's investigation had provided. The inherited ranch property was designated as a federal memorial honoring undercover investigators who had risked their lives to protect national security, with the water tower and underground facilities being preserved as training and educational resources for law enforcement agencies dealing with complex criminal organizations that target military families and government assets. The financial benefits from asset forfeiture and federal compensation programs provided complete financial security for my family's future, enabling me to expand my consulting business into a comprehensive support organization for military families dealing with disability, inheritance, and legal challenges that could make them vulnerable to criminal targeting and manipulation.
Titan's role in detecting the concealed evidence and protecting our family during the criminal investigation was recognized through special commendations from military working dog organizations, and his training and behavioral patterns were studied by federal agencies developing enhanced detection and security protocols for protecting sensitive facilities and operations from criminal penetration and theft. The Sarah Brennan Foundation, established using resources recovered from the criminal organization's assets, now provides comprehensive support services for military families facing inheritance disputes, financial manipulation, and criminal targeting that exploits their service-related vulnerabilities and psychological trauma. The Foundation's services include legal representation, security consultation, and family counseling specifically designed to help military families recognize and resist criminal recruitment operations that target their patriotism, financial pressures, and trust in people who claim to understand military culture and service-related challenges. My personal transformation from a disabled veteran struggling with inheritance problems to the director of a foundation protecting military families throughout the country represents the unexpected way that criminal attacks against our family ultimately enabled us to serve our fellow veterans and their families more effectively than we ever could have achieved through conventional career and service paths. The water tower that initially appeared to be a worthless liability inherited from a grandfather I barely knew became the key to exposing and destroying criminal organizations that had been systematically victimizing military families for decades, while providing resources and capabilities that enable ongoing protection and support for the families who continue serving our country despite the criminal organizations that continue targeting them for their service and sacrifice. Titan and I continue working together to provide security consultation and threat assessment services for military families and government agencies, using the detection capabilities and situational awareness that saved our family to protect other families who face similar criminal targeting and manipulation. Our partnership demonstrates that the bonds forged through military service extend beyond official duties to encompass lifelong commitment to protecting the people and institutions that defend our country's security and freedom. The story of Grandpa Tom's 20-year undercover investigation and the criminal conspiracy that murdered him to protect their theft operations serves as a reminder that threats to national security often come from within the institutions and communities that we trust most, and that protecting military families requires constant vigilance against people who exploit service members' dedication and sacrifice for criminal profit and personal gain. The modest ranch property that seemed like a financial burden has become the headquarters for operations that continue Grandpa Tom's mission of protecting military families and national security assets from criminal organizations that view veterans and their families as targets of opportunity rather than people deserving respect and protection for their service and sacrifice. But the most important lesson from our family's experience is that criminal organizations that target military families through recruitment and manipulation ultimately underestimate the strength, resourcefulness, and determination that military training provides for recognizing threats and protecting the people and values that matter most. The battle for justice and protection of military families continues every day through the work of the Foundation and the ongoing partnership between law enforcement agencies and veteran organizations that are committed to ensuring that the people who serve our country receive the protection and support they have earned through their dedication and sacrifice. Marcus eventually rebuilt his life through counseling and career development that helped him understand and overcome the manipulation tactics that have been used against him. And while our marriage couldn't survive the damage caused by his recruitment and deception, we maintained cooperative relationships focused on protecting our shared values and ensuring that other families receive the support and resources necessary to resist similar criminal targeting operations. The empty water tower that contained the key to justice and transformation for our family stands as a monument to the principle that appearances often deceive, that ordinary people possess extraordinary capabilities when they're properly prepared and supported, and that the greatest threats to our security often come disguised as help and support from people who understand exactly how to exploit our trust and vulnerabilities for their own criminal purposes. Today, families facing similar inheritance mysteries, relationship betrayals, and criminal targeting can access resources and support that weren't available during our crisis, ensuring that future victims will receive protection and assistance before criminal organizations can complete their manipulation and theft operations. The legacy of Grandpa Tom's investigation and the criminal conspiracy that targeted our family is measured not only in the prosecutions and asset recovery that brought justice, but also in the ongoing protection provided to military families who continue serving our country, despite the criminal organizations that continue viewing their service and sacrifice as opportunities for exploitation and profit.